Welcome to Avenue M. My name is Joey Taylor.
And I'm Haroon Mogul.
We're two men on a journey of faith and meaning. In each episode, we unpack the moments that shape us, the struggles that build us, and the questions that intrigue us. Conspiracy theories have always been with us, but they seem to carry a different kind of power in an anxious and fragmented age. Some turn out to contain kernels of truth, others unravel under scrutiny, and most of us are left wondering how to tell the difference. In the first of this two-part conversation, Haroon and I explore why conspiracy theories are so compelling, what needs in us they satisfy, and whether there are habits of mind and spirit that can help us pursue truth without falling into paranoia. Part 2 continues next week.
I want to start with an apology.
Okay.
I want to start this episode with an apology. I spoke very dismissively of Elon Musk in our last episode, and I shouldn't have done that. Not because I'm justifying what Elon Musk said. Absolutely not. The way he refused to answer a question about whether or not he was anti-Muslim, the way in which he pointedly excluded Muslims from the people he hires in senior positions in the company, all of that is beyond the pale. But in contemptuously dismissing him, I did something that is untrue to my own values. I do not want this podcast and my own framework to be so reductive and so reactive, not because people deserve a pass, but because the short form takedown only elicits short form takedowns. And a long form, intensely thought through, robustly supported takedown is impossible to repudiate. And that's what we should be doing. We should be elevating the discourse, even in order to reject people who believe frankly ridiculous things like Elon Musk does about Muslims, including conspiracy theories, which is a great place to pivot to the topic of today's episode. I want to ask you why this is of interest to you specifically.
The primary reason is because I feel pulled in by some aspects of conspiracy theories. I think that I am particularly, I don't know if susceptible is the right word, but I'm tempted by kind of the classic populist sort of message. I'm thinking about the work of Ian Haney Lopez, who says something like the billionaire class is Bernie Sanders or whatever. These elites are trying to figure out schema strategies to divide everyday Americans so they can maintain power for themselves. And he would point to things like race, the construction of race, for example, or, transgender rights, that elites are trying to find wedge issues to keep us divided so they can maintain power. And that really resonates with me. I think there is some truth in it. And I also often wonder, to what extent is it helpful for me personally to focus on that and to believe that?
When you said you wanted to talk about conspiracy theories, for me, it was doubly interesting because we live in a moment where we're all convinced that there are certain conspiratorial forces swirling all around us. There is, as we talked about earlier, a fair amount of evidence that some of the things that we thought were conspiracy theories or might have labeled conspiracy theories in polite company a few years ago turned out to have been true, namely Islands and Epstein's.
Yes.
But also because I've been, as a member of a Muslim community, on the receiving end of conspiracy theories, which is where I want to introduce, surprisingly, the comic element. When we were talking about this earlier, you said you couldn't imagine that there would be jokes in this episode, but we as American Muslims often joked about this. Not in the sense of being dismissive or contemptuous, but, sometimes you make light of something because it's so ridiculous and even hurtful and harmful that the only way you can defend yourself or even survive the moment is by being bleakly comic about it. And so for the last couple decades and a half or so, pretty much for my entire adult life, I've been hearing people on the right claim that there is a conspiracy by Muslims to take over the world. And sometimes in the slightly more generous forms, it's a communist Islamist conspiracy. Somehow Zohran Mamdani's at the leading edge of this, to somehow enforce atheism and Sharia law at the same time and destroy Western civilization from within. And for us as American Muslims, it was preposterous because we would go to our mosques and it would be a kind of managed chaos at best. We were constantly in debt. You couldn't raise enough money. Half the time the sermon you heard at the mic was embarrassing. People were illegally parking. You didn't have enough, and then you would sit there and say, wait, people think that the most powerful country in the world is going to be taken over by effectively this mosque. This mosque can't even cover the cost of the imam to get healthcare. And then you're telling me that there's this vast conspiracy that I'm a part of, when really everyone in the room, if you actually talk to them, their main focus is, I want my kids to get a good job. I want them to get married and be happy and be healthy and just the ordinary stuff. If I get sick, I hope I have health insurance. But the reason I'm saying this is, why then do conspiracy theories, in your mind, endure for so long when many of them should be on their face absurd?
I think a lot of this has to do with a level of anxiety at trying to determine what is true and trustworthy. What conspiracy theories often do is they present a unified, a grand theory of like all of reality. And it says, this is actually how, this is the scheme that everything can be fit into. And so in some ways, it relieves the anxiety that we're bringing into our world. But I think in other ways, it's interesting because it sure seems to ramp up anxiety and fear as well. But there's a clear sense of us and them. There's a clear sense of the epistemological structure of how to make sense of the world as it has been defined. And so I think that's what it offers. As I was sort of thinking about this conversation, knowing your background, I mean, both as like a writer, a journalist, that kind of stuff, but also as in terms of like helping out young people to sort of figure out their place in the world. How do you think about what it looks like to determine the veracity of certain news, of certain information? Like, what are some of the things that you do to kind of make sure that you're on stable footing when you're making sense of what's happening in the world?
One of the things I really appreciate, when we had this conversation a few weeks back. We put it on the Substack, I remember, on Instagram, that these are the topics we're going to be talking about in weeks to come, and conspiracy theories. So it was in my mind in a way that it wouldn't have been quite so explicitly. I had to actually think about, what is a conspiracy theory?
Yeah.
What is the opposite of a conspiracy theory? And for that one, I have a simple answer. It's a theory. And in the last few weeks, as I've been driving, sitting, thinking, even preparing syllabi, have been thinking about what a conspiracy theory is, how we can understand them, and how we can break them down, while also acknowledging the real underlying concern and anxiety that's in operation.
Yes.
I'd like to piece together a theory in this episode of what a conspiracy theory is and how we can inoculate ourselves.
Ooh, like it.
Against
I
them,
love that. Yeah.
Right? I want to do a vaccine, since vaccines are clearly now apparently a conspiracy theory. But and so I actually want to go back to what you said. You talked about the anxiety, the fear, the uncertainty. And so one element of conspiracy theory is it necessarily demands that you believe there's something nefarious happening in places and spaces you don't know much about.
Right.
And so what that means is, the first question I would ask of a conspiracy theory is, do I as a person have access to any of the spaces that are being described, right? Obviously, I have no way of knowing what's happening at Davos or in some room in the White House. No one's ever inviting me to those spaces, inshallah. Yet, I can find out something about a community that lives in the same city as me. Like, let's take J.D. Vance's, was it Cats and Dogs or was it just cats? Was it, what were the Haitian immigrants eating in J.D. Vance's deeply Catholic ascription and aspersion?
I think Cats and Dogs. Yeah.
Cats and dogs. Okay.
Yeah.
So it rains cats and dogs, and then cats and dogs are also being served. It's a very strange world that the vice president has to live in. And then imagine that he's negotiating with Iran on ending this war. You knew I had to bring it in. But I can, as a person, I might not know what's happening at that level, the political level, right? But I can probably figure out what's happening in a city half an hour away. And so I think the first thing I would say, if someone comes to me with a conspiracy theory, is I want to break down the component parts. What are the pieces that this theory demands that actually are accessible? Right? So when people say things like they're enforcing Sharia law in London, are they really? Like, you cannot, as an Englishman, go to London and walk around and just see what's happening, right? Preferably you take someone who can help you make sense of things, right? But like, you know, like I can think all kinds of things about what Christians or Jews believe, but I also have access to a fair amount of that, or I should. Or is that unfair? So I'm actually asking you, this is me trying to make sense. Like, I'm trying to pull apart the pieces and see where it is we get to a point where someone can actually say they're eating cats and dogs, if that is indeed what he said.
Well, so not to be a buzzkill here, but
be a buzzkill.
It's really interesting that you bring up the Haitians in Springfield, because the impact of that narrative, like we're seeing it now.
It's huge.
Yeah, the Supreme Court has revoked these Haitians' temporary protective status. They're on the verge of being deported. Even our conservative governor, Mike DeWine, is saying this is not a good idea. We shouldn't be doing this. But yet, that is a part of what allowed this particular administration to be elected. I mean, we don't have to get into all of the appointments of Supreme Court justices and all the things that kind of like fell. But I think like it's really easy to say conspiracy theory, and the impact of this narrative, which was total hogwash, totally crazy, is significant. It's really significant on the communities that maybe we're not a part of, but aren't so far away from us.
Yeah, we're not a part of, but I can certainly sympathize, because a lot of similar invective has been lobbed our way as Muslims, as South Asians. In my case, my parents are immigrants. But this is where I find this conversation really helpful. And so maybe I'll take a step back and I'll give you where I started my definition of conspiracy theory.
Mm-hmm.
Weirdly, it was with the word cult. And I think in one of our conversations previously, we had brought up, what is a cult? And then I thought about, what is the difference between a cult and a religion? And it sort of, it brings to mind, there's that saying that a language is a dialect that has an army. You know, that kind of thing, right? So a religion is a cult that's gone mainstream. You hear that kind of dismissive thing.
Yeah.
So I was actually thinking, so like, what is the difference between a cult and a religion? Yeah. And I came up with maybe not a working definition, but a working concept.
Okay.
And the concept is that a religion contains within itself enough resources to police itself by its own metrics.
Oh, interesting.
So, for example, in an authoritarian state, let's say the most kind of extreme example, 1984. Reality is just what, quote unquote, Big Brother says. And there is no ground you can stand on to criticize Big Brother, except that it leads to your annihilation and erasure. In America, for example, there's that famous saying by Bill Clinton, which I actually really quite like. He said, I believe he said something to the effect of, there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what's right with America. And it's a nice political slogan. It kind of rolls off the tongue in a certain way. But if you really think about democracy checks and balances, America was designed in such a way that ideally it can fix itself if it starts to break. And I think a religion is a system that has resources within it that its adherents can argue and build with each other and disagree with each other within the same big tent. So when Martin Luther goes and nails the 95 Theses on the wall, if that's actually what happened, I don't know. I'm not an expert on Christian history. But the point is, he used Christian scripture and Christian ideas to criticize the church. And obviously it led to a schism. I don't know that that was his intent. It seems, from what I understand, and I could be wrong, he was trying to reform the church, not break the church, right? And obviously, a lot of it depends on how the church responds. I could think of, in the Muslim tradition, when the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, Hussein, refuses to give bay'ah, to give allegiance to the reigning caliph. He doesn't do so by saying, oh, Islam is wrong, X, Y, and Z. Obviously, he's not going to say that. He's the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. He says that you are not fulfilling the commands of our religion. And then Hussein's opponent, Yazid, says, no, according to our religion, I'm the caliph, and you must obey me, no matter who you are. Like, they're having a debate within the confines of that epistemic universe. A cult doesn't allow you to do that. And a conspiracy theory, I would say, this is a very long way to get there, doesn't have the tools to critique itself internally. That's not the only qualifier of what a conspiracy theory is. But it doesn't permit substantive internal critique. That's one. It's necessary but not sufficient. So tell me first, does that make sense?
I'm trying not to get distracted, but I need to say a little bit about the cult religion thing, and then I'll...
Okay, awesome. We have now 2 episodes. Isn't that convenient, Joey? It's like I planned that.
So that definition of the distinction between cult and religion is interesting to me, because there are moments in religious history. I'm thinking about the pedophilia scandal in the Catholic Church, for example, or I mean, there's tons of that in the Protestant churches as well that I could point to. I'm not trying to single out the Catholic Church in any way, but I mean, there's a lot of these different things that have happened, right? And so it makes me wonder if in those moments when critique and accountability was attempted, but in large part failed, if then those religions are slipping into more of a cult territory. And so that's the first question I have. The second question I'm wondering is like the example of Martin Luther, or even the division between Shia and Sunni. I'm not sure I would say either one of those are examples of accountability being had within the religious system itself, because it led to schism. It led to split. Now, I think for a lot of Protestants now, they would see Catholicism as a part of quote unquote global Christianity, but that hasn't been the case for most of the history of Protestantism. They have really kind of conceived of themselves as a separate religion. I don't agree with that designation, but what I'm saying is that I think within a cult, you could come against a authoritative kind of figure and say, I disagree with your take on it, and start your own cult. I think it's really difficult to discern between what a cult and a religion is. And in the same way, it's very difficult to discern between what a conspiracy theory is and just a worldview. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's a very difficult distinction. One of the things that seems very important to me, and something I appreciate about Islam, for example, especially Sunni Islam, is that it feels like conspiracy theories, as well as cult-like religious structures, rely on hierarchy and authoritative structure that doesn't allow for high levels of dissent or agency for kind of the common folk. I think that's a through line that really resonates with me. But I'm not totally sure about internal systems of accountability, just because human systems struggle so much with that.
So let me push back on this, because I think I hear what you're saying, and it's an important critique. And again, I'm building this as I podcast it. So I'm being very honest about the fact that I don't fully know. But I think the distinction is important, and let me tell you why.
Okay.
In Sunni Islam, in the Protestant tradition, in Shia Islam, in Catholicism, you develop over time sophisticated institutions that translate, mediate, and interpret key texts and principles.
Oh.
And when I say sophisticated, I mean that intentionally. Robust institutions that ask hard questions, right? So, for example, does the medical establishment occasionally get things wrong? Yes, absolutely they do. And they would be the first to admit that. That's part of the whole idea of having a hypothesis and testing it out.
Scientific process. That's what it is.
Yeah. We figured it out. But there's a lot of stuff they've gotten right. Right? And so we have medical schools and credit hours and academies and conferences, right? You build this apparatus over time that translates your ideas. So I can go to various different Sunni madrasas, seminaries, and learn the tradition. And if I learn enough of it, I can participate in an argument and not necessarily come to the same conclusion. Now, I'm not trained as a sheikh, but I had time in Sufi spaces and came to disagree with certain key aspects of tasawwuf or Sufism. There's a lot I still love about it, but there's others that disquieted me. And so my participation in those spaces ended, and I changed how I practice my Islam. My point with conspiracy theories is a conspiracy theory will never evolve that level of sophistication because it is by definition impossible.
Yeah.
So no matter how many times we talk about how the 2020 election was stolen, we've still not gotten a single piece of evidence. I'm not even talking about a sophisticated argument, a thesis paper, a university, a school of thought, something that can last more than months or years, that can handle robust argument. And you're right. Sometimes it breaks apart, right? You have the Catholic Protestant schism. Absolutely. But I would argue that in the larger history of religions, more often than not, the tensions have either been managed, tolerated, or forced reckonings. Not necessarily in a short-term timeline. You're right. The abuse scandal, for example, we still feel the effects of that. But if we come back to this conversation in 100 years, in theory, I would imagine that we would be in a different place, inshallah, right? And I would say the same for abuse in Muslim spaces, things like that. So I think that part of what makes a conspiracy theory different from a theory is that it doesn't allow you to have deep conversations with people who share the same premises but disagree on the specifics, because there's no actual substance behind the specific. It's accusation or allegation. If you find there is substance behind the specifics, then you're now moving into the territory of theory, and you can have competing interpretations of what happened. Does that make sense or no? I'm just thinking out loud. Like, because you did ask a really good question. How do you teach someone to avoid a conspiracy or a cult or something of the kind. And that's how I'm beginning to think about it.
Well, a couple of thoughts. First thought is that for a lot of these conspiracy theories, they often point to some actual facts to help to build this particular conspiracy theory. For me, some of the challenges are the way that they draw connections between the existing facts that begins to be problematic. So it is a theory in the sense of they're using some existing data. They're not talking about an alien world, right? So I think that's an important thing to say. The second thing I think, for a second to dip back into the religion and cult thing, is I often think about the distinction between religion and cult as the difference between antiquity and novelty. So one of the things that constitutes a religion is that it's been around for a long time. And one of the things that makes a cult is that it's pretty new. I think within that distinction, there are the things that you're talking about. There are mechanisms in place to engage with complex ideas with a complex world. There's mechanisms of accountability. There's institutional life that has formed around it. And so almost definitionally, if you stick around for long enough, the cult will have to find itself as a religion eventually, because it needs to build those things around it in order to sustain. And so I think that the simplicity and complexity piece is a huge part of it. And a simplistic worldview isn't going to stand up to the scrutiny of time. It can't. What's difficult with that is that in this moment, when we're trying to make sense of this moment, we don't know what will stand up to the scrutiny of time. And we're not going to be in those rooms, and whether it's the White House or Davos or whatever. And so we have to rely on people who say, but I've been in those rooms. I've talked to those people. And I have a compelling narrative about what's happening. And I know it seems in your world like what's happening doesn't have a whole lot of rationale, but let me give you the explanatory system that will kind of unlock things for you. And man, that is incredibly tempting. It's hard to say no to that.
Yeah. And in fairness, there are times where things that are dismissed as conspiracies are later proven to be
True.
far closer to the truth than to fiction. But here's where I'll pause with this, because I'm sitting with what you're saying and I'm trying to make sense of whether or not I can make sense of it. So I'm actively cogitating. The time element is definitely part of it, but I would say there's two other parts of it where I don't think it's just a matter of time. One point is, can you marshal an alternate explanation that makes any kind of sense? If a theory is well built, it is hard to disprove and takes serious effort to disprove. And disinterested or neutral observers would have to really work hard to make sense of what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a conspiracy theory, I think it's rather the case that you've come up with a web of connections that feel compelling, but don't really stand up to any kind of scrutiny, or even a simple alternate explanation. So I'll give you an example. And maybe I'll go back to cult and religion, because I think there's a second part to this that I think is valuable. The difference between a cult and a religion isn't just the ability to conduct internal critique. It's the ability of an outsider to follow a chain of reasoning, even if they don't accept the foundational premises.
Uh-huh.
And so it operates according to recognizable patterns of thought that can lead to conclusions that make sense. So I'll give you an example of the Quran. So that's the primary Muslim scripture, of course, is the Quran. And people will sometimes ask me, how do you know that the Quran you're reading now is the same Quran that existed in the 620s or 630s?
Yeah.
And I can give a religious argument, but that's not going to make sense to the person. I would then be arguing on premises they don't accept, which defeats the purpose. But I think there is a secular explanation that makes equal sense. The divide between Sunni and Shia Muslims literally starts on the first day after the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, passes away, over the question of who's going to succeed him.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, if you look at the evolution of Sunni and Shia Islam, there emerge differences in how they practice, because who they go back to in the chain of authority is slightly different at times. So we pray a little bit differently. We do some things kind of differently. We recognize each other's practice, but not 100%. But we have the same Quran. It's impossible to imagine that if the Quran hadn't been written before that and preserved, that these two people who were fighting with each other within decades, in some cases, would have agreed on the same text.
Mm-hmm.
right? Like it's a pretty easy, simple explanation, right? It doesn't require you to believe that, therefore, that doesn't mean you have to believe the book is from God, right? That's a religious belief. That's a different conversation. But you can conduct a little bit of historical common sense thinking.
Uh-huh.
And I think that with conspiracy theories, they often don't permit simple, easy, alternate explanations. So maybe the reason this happened and this happened is not because of some nefarious backroom deal, but because two powerful actors have a lot of incentives to keep themselves in power. And so it's sort of like a you scratch my back, I scratch your back. That's just kind of how human beings behave. And we do that in micro scenarios. We do that on our PTA board, maybe, or like you can find parallel forms of reasoning. Does that make sense or no?
I think one of the things that kind of inoculates me against conspiracy thinking is that it often feels like, to me, a bunch of people are responding to the same incentives as opposed to a mastermind laying those incentives and putting those incentives in place.
It's human nature.
That's the thing that I come back to. Well, what actually is the incentive system here? What are people responding to? Maybe it's not actually an elite cabal of people who are putting all of these things in place. I think that's helpful. It's really interesting to me to make this connection to religion and cults, because in the same way that there's a foundational text in Islam, I wonder if some of the things that we can appeal to within the American context is the Martin Luther King kind of impulse. Can we appeal to some foundational documents as the construction of mythic identity or something that we can all say, yeah, but we're still working towards this. And as long as we're still like being guided by and working towards this, maybe that's a helpful sandbox for us to have a conversation within.
Tell me more. What do you like unpack that in terms of, let's say I'm going down the rabbit hole, that I am susceptible to conspiracy theory. I don't know what the conspiracy theory would be, but let's say I'm starting to act and speak in ways that concern you. How would what you just said apply to me? Or how would you apply it to me directly? Like, hey, Haroon.
So I think that very often the conspiracy theories are cognitively consistent within the predispositions that have already been laid. So it's the issue is like trying to actually overcome those initial kind of assumptions. That's what's difficult. But in the case of the Sunni and Shia divide, what you're saying is like the foundational assumptions are determined by this text, and how we read this text and what we make of it and who can read it and how they can read it. We can have that discussion, but our starting place is this text. And in a similar way, I think it would be so helpful if we could just agree on what is our starting place that we're going to kind of build our hermeneutical or epistemic system from. I think that is a really challenging thing. So if we can say, as long as you're starting with these assumptions, that the government is for the people and by the people, that all men, there's a natural law sense of the value of all man, that, like as long as we can start there, then we can have a conversation about how you're making sense of this in light of the current reality. I don't know. I'm not sure, but it's interesting to me to think about. Thanks for listening, and thanks to Zach Swellbar for recording our theme music. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and let us know what questions we should be asking and who else we should be talking to. This conversation continues next week.